Happy Halloween!
All right, the Halloween decorations are up, and as always, we have to select a couple of Poe stories. We did, Goldbug, and then The Devil in the Belfry this year.
The Belfry. Take us to Crazy Town, Una.
Well, so, what is your one word to describe this story?
Zany. Nah. Chronos. Chronology.
Oh, I get it, because of the time. That's not bad.
What time is it?
How do you like this word? Edenic.
Oh, that's a good one. And I guess if I could maybe give a one-sentencer, it's an atypical Poe story.
I kind of struggled with this story as a whole, I will say. And I fought the urge, but at one point I was like, okay, do I try to make an argument? Because sometimes we just have conversations and sometimes we make, cases. And I was like, am I going to make the case that this is the reverse of Adam and Eve, right? Like, kind of like Adam and Eve had like the perfect utopia, right? Like the Garden of Eden was perfect. There was no death, there was no disease, et cetera, right? And due to like a choice of theirs, then everything was perverted and we had the fall of man, right? And I was like, wow, like there's a lot in this story about how everything's perfect, right? Like they don't want anything from the outside. Why? Because everything's perfect inside, right? And you have like the central clock that can never be broken down. It was everywhere. I'm like, oh, okay. So that's kind of like the omnipotent, everywhere, like omnipresent type being. And then you had like the devil basically roll into town and destroy utopia essentially. And even if you look at it, like I think they described their jobs as perfect sinecures. And if you didn't know what that word meant, it actually is a job that pays but has little to no work, and the word comes from medieval Latin phrase sine cura, sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, which means without cure, and the term originally referred to a church position where the job holder didn't have to care for the spiritual needs of the church members. And they mentioned that word a couple times, so I'm like, okay, I think there's a case there, but Poe's such a strong writer. I think I want to back that up and just talk about that idea of the destruction of utopia in general, which is clearly a thing in the story.
I also struggle with the story overall. And again, I was looking for what is Poe's angle? What am I supposed to get out of this? And I kept looking at, okay, is there a religious thing? Because there's the devil, okay, that has some religious tone to it, right? There's the belfry, which is usually in a church or some type of structure that has the bell that a lot of times, is a main structure in town, a center point. A lot of people's lives revolve around a center point of religion. Where's the context of this? Where am I going? What am I looking for? I just couldn't get it. There is an element of chaos, and for me, eventually, that was kind of the interpretation. I also abandoned my thought process of, the religious route and just went with more of a generalized route.
So, wonder what time it is. Yes, that is a play on words, and we have a lot of descriptions of this town, from all of their cabbage to all of their circular and time-based needs and carvings. It's a town that just works, okay? It's almost Edenic. It's perfect, right? Like there's nothing that's out of place here. And I guess that's kind of one of the first questions of like utopias. We love stories where utopias are perverted. They're destroyed. A lot of times they're set up to look perfect, but then there's a facade that's destroyed and we see something fragile and weak behind the scenes. Why can humans not be we're not trusting in general, but why do we never trust perfection?
I think because we see the flaws in ourselves, that we know that we're not perfect. So how could anything be perfect? It doesn't seem realistic. It doesn't feel trustworthy because it's something we can't recognize in ourselves. And to this story, it feels like if one thing becomes imperfect, everything is then not perfect.
Have you ever heard how like certain jobs, in order to find like satisfaction, like if you're a boss and you're like, hey, I need to keep my employees happy, yeah, you could throw money at them. That's one thing. But another thing is autonomy. The idea of giving them a choice, making them feel like they're making an impact to the work. Like you can give them a perfect system, they're not going to be happy with it. what actually would make them happier is if they got to change something. And I think, you brought up a good word there, chaos. Chaos, change. It's something about how when we as humans feel like we're contributing to something, it's more rewarding, it's more personal. And I think that there's something mistrustful about if something's perfect, then I can't be a part of it, right? Because I'm an imperfect human being, right? Like, I don't know. Maybe there's someone out there watching that's like, no, I'm perfect. I'm like, good for you. But most people, like, I don't know, if you have to change something, that is not congruous with a situation that's perfect, because then you can't be a part of it.
Yeah, I also look at and reflect upon myself when reading these stories, and I recognize that a lot of my life I view through the venue of my flaws and faults, my mistakes. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to call them regrets, but I look back and say, oh, wow, I did that. But it made me who I am today. I messed up here. I learned from that. We learn from our faults. We learn from our mistakes. We learn from our losses. And these people are living in this utopia where how can they learn if they never make a mistake? If you never fall down, if you never touch that stove that's hot, how do you learn that that's going to hurt you? And I think that we grow as people through our mistakes. And I don't want to say that that is a good thing, but I think it is something to look and reflect upon positively, that all of your mistakes aren't necessarily bad things. And in this world, this chaos opens up for growth. There has to be death for life and vice versa.
So let me hit you with this one. There's clearly a central focal point of this town is this clock. It has 7 faces. The whole town is circular. Their gardens are circular. Like, obviously time has no end or beginning, hence why it always just repeats itself. What do you think this clock is? It's got 7 faces. If we're going to go back to the Garden of Eden interpretation, obviously you have 7 deadly sins, but it's something that keeps the people going and understanding where they are. Like, if everything was circular and everything was repeated ad nauseum because it's perfect, how do you know where you are? Well, a clock is a way of measuring distance and time in between events that you're supposed to be participating in, right? And I think it's interesting when we think about power in the story. Where's the power?
Yeah, the cabbages? I don't know, clocks and cabbages, but I guess the Belfry, that's the focal point of what regulates the town, so that would be, quote, the power.
Yeah, I would say so, because it's kind of like, we don't have a good idea of the democracy, of the monarchy, but you have all the people are just kind of like existing. And what I like about utopian stories is a lot of time the power is in the few, right? Like, it's given to one specific person, because if it were distributed amongst a lot of different things, well, why would you need to distribute it unless there was something imperfect? Like, usually distributing is about covering up weaknesses or covering up mistakes. So a lot of times you have it in a strict monarchy control. And a lot of times, I guess you can interpret utopias as kind of like that Enlightenment concept of monarchies, like having all the power, essentially. But in this story, you basically have the guy that makes sure everybody knows what time it is, right? So if we're going to see that utopians need to have their lives challenged, introduce chaos, to use your word earlier, you need to disrupt that power. Right. And I think that's what's interesting about this story is where does that devil, who comes in wearing a suspicious grin and such, he goes straight after that clock, and he immediately roughs up the guy that's ringing it and changes the tones essentially to have more tones than intended. And it's once it hits that 12th and then 13th, and then I guess if you're doing the religious interpretation, 13, the number of the traitor, if you will, of course, with the disciples. You have clearly chaos being introduced and challenging the power of the town by going straight to the thing that is measuring them and keeping them in line, essentially.
Yeah, as you come back to it and you look at all the little references, I think that being that we know it's Poe, there could be the undertone of religion there. I went a little crazy in my thought process, so follow me down the rabbit hole. Mm-hmm. I Poe had been known to be kind of a drinker and maybe use other substances. I was sober when I was reading this. But I thought of another story of the Grinch. Follow along with me. Christmas story, I know. But in the Grinch movie, they start off the movie and they fly into Whoville, and they fly into a snowflake, that like a whole world could exist on a snowflake. And it got me thinking, and I wish that there was the number 12 somewhere in here, because I think that it would have fit my crazy thought process a little better. 13 just quite isn't there, 7 isn't there, but they keep describing all the people with these round faces, like they have faces of clocks. I imagine Poe laying down for the night after a good night of having fun, and maybe he's staring at his pocket watch, and he imagines himself flying into the gears of the pocket watch, and the people are these gears. Their round faces are the gears, and we're inside this utopia of time, and that's where he's taking his dream thought process from, and that he is coming in here as the devil himself and disrupting the clock. He's disrupting time. He's throwing things off by his presence. And that's what we kind of do as people, is when we go into unknown scenarios, we throw things off with our presence. I don't know.
Well, I kind of view, if something were perfect, it doesn't need redundancy. It doesn't need backups because it's perfect. It doesn't fail. Right? And when you have that system, we know that by breaking it, the fragility of the system, the fragility of our societies, and all of the things that we rely upon, we realize how imperfect things are. Like, I think, where did I hear that stat? Like, I want to say, like, if you wanted to cause national disruption, all you had to do was, I think it was like, you needed to have like, I think it's like 1% of the population revolt. It seems like 0.5%, maybe 2%, but it's a very small amount where just they stop doing what they're supposed to do. Or they shut down.
Just electricity, yeah.
Yeah, and everything crumbles because we have such a reliancy upon others, upon the grid, upon our food, upon our clothing. Like, so few people are jacks of all trades now. Right, like, and I've even heard my neighbor, like, they said, like, oh, like, you're making your own food, way to be off the grid. And it's like, well, no, we still need power, right? Like, we still have transportation and other obligations that we have to pay the government for and such. Like, it's almost impossible to not be a part of a system. And when we expose how fragile that system is, it can be terrifying, right? It's almost like utopia is like mocking our idealism in the face of that. The realism, the reality is just how weak we all are with this lattice-like framework we have called society.
At the beginning, you'd ask what word I would use to describe this, and as we're discussing this, I think of that, obviously this was some satirical type story, and so I ask you this question: do you think Poe made this one, maybe not in mind of how we're going to talk about it 100 some years later, but the fact that he made it so different than his other stories? It doesn't have that gothic feel. It doesn't have that Poe feel. It feels very zany. Like, if you didn't tell me this was a Poe story, I would have struggled to know that it was written by him. I would have maybe picked out some elements. I maybe would have seen that it was written during his lifetime, or it had references or odes to him. Maybe somebody wrote it as a tribute to something like him. But do you think he did that on purpose to almost represent chaos within his own genre? That his story was so different than, like, I have 99 stories, but The Devil in the Belfry ain't one.
I actually thought you were going to go a different location or different destination. I had a lot of, you remember Washington Irving with the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, like the Dutch influence and such.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
I thought you were going that direction because there is criticism as to whether this story was a critique, but particularly as we talk about these power elements of the president at the time, Van Buren, right? In terms of the Dutch ancestry and stuff like that, that I guess some people have drawn some parallels. And exactly as I thought you were going in that point, we're hundreds of years removed, that might not be the first thing that jumps out to your head as you read it today.
Yeah, you're not going to reference that history from 1838 or whenever this was written and published. So
Yeah, 1839 was wild times, if I recall. I'm just kidding. well over a century removed from that. But let us know what you thought of the story, viewers out there. Did you kind of see the chaos in the story? Did you view it more biblical? Let us know in the comments down below, along with checking out the other Poe playlists that we have down below, as we've done plenty of his stories. My name's been Una. Thank you for spending time with us today. Peace.
Happy Halloween.